If you think a life sentence means your life is over, think again. Some people have walked into prison with the world convinced they'd never see the outside again, yet somehow, against all odds, they survived decades behind bars and walked free. These are people who stared down time itself, where every tick of the clock was a reminder of what they'd lost. And yet they kept breathing long enough to outlast punishments that seemed impossible. We're talking about sentences so long, you'd think the calendar would give up before they did. And yet here they are. These aren't just stories about crime and punishment, they about the strange ways life can twist. Both the mental and physical battles waged in cells smaller than most people's closets. And about a world that sometimes forgets you exist, until one day, you reappear in it. Let's start with two cases that show survival in its most extreme form. One man who stayed so long he became part of the prison itself. And another who endured a type of isolation most of us can't even imagine without breaking. Hush 10. Paul Geidel, the man who spent 68 years behind bars. Picture New York City in 1911, gaslights flickering on street corners, horse-drawn carriages mixing with the first motor cars, and young bellhops hustling in hotels filled with wealthy businessmen. Among them was 17-year-old Paul Geidel, a boy whose life was already teetering on the edge. Orphaned young, raised in foster homes, and with little education, Paul took work where he could find it. But the streets were unforgiving, and opportunities were scarce. One summer night, desperate and reckless, Paul decided to rob William H. Jackson, 73-year-old broker staying at the Iroquois Hotel. The robbery turned violent, and Jackson was killed. Paul was caught quickly, his youth doing nothing to save him from the justice system. Convicted of second-degree murder, he was sentenced to 20 years to life, a sentence that, by the standards of the time, was severe for someone so young. But prison in the early 1900s wasn't the rehabilitation system we talk about today. It was grim, overcrowded, and brutal. For Paul, the days turned into years, and those years turned into something stranger. After about 6 years, doctors labeled him insane. He was transferred to Massachusetts State Hospital for the criminally insane. Their life slowed to a crawl. The outside world roared ahead. World War I ended. Prohibition began and ended. Radios became televisions. And men landed on the moon, but Paul's world was 4 walls, a bed, and a routine so repetitive that the calendar stopped meaning much. Decades later, as officials periodically reviewed his case, Paul could have walked free. Parole was offered as early as the 1950s, but each time he refused. Why? Because after so long, prison had become his only home. Outside was no longer familiar. It was alien. Streets had turned into canyons of skyscrapers. Cars replaced carriages, and the slang, the fashion, even the sounds of the city were strange. Everyone he'd known was gone. Freedom to him wasn't safety. It was terror. In 1974, at 80 years old, Paul was offered parole again, and again he refused. It wasn't until 1980, at 86 years old, that he finally agreed to leave. By then, he had served 68 years and 245 days, the longest sentence served by any U.S. inmate who lived to be released. He walked into a city full of neon lights, boomboxes, and taxicabs, an unrecognizable world. After a brief period in a nursing home, Paul faded into obscurity. His story a quiet testament to the strange way time bends behind bars. #9. Albert Woodfox, the man who survived 43 years in solitary confinement. If Paul's survival was about becoming part of the prison, Albert Woodfox's was about resisting it with every fiber of his being. Albert's life changed in 1971, already serving time for armed robbery in Louisiana's infamous Angola prison. He was accused along with fellow inmates Herman Wallace and Robert King of murdering a prison guard named Brent Miller. The case against them was controversial. Evidence was thin, witnesses unreliable, and decades later, courts would repeatedly overturn the convictions. But in 1972, Albert was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. That alone would have been crushing, but his punishment was far worse than just life. Albert was placed in solitary confinement, not for a few months or years. For 43 straight years, his cell was about 6 feet wide and 9 feet long. Inside, a bed, a metal toilet, a small shelf. He was allowed out for 1 hour a day, often to walk alone in a caged yard. Human contact was almost non-existent. The silence was so deep it could feel like a weight pressing on his ears, broken only by the occasional clank of a guard's keys or the distant echo of other prisoners' voices. To survive, Albert built himself a strict routine. He exercised in his cell, reading books until the pages wore thin, and practiced meditation to keep his mind sharp. He refused to let the walls close in on him mentally, telling himself he would not die in a state of bitterness or despair. Outside his cell, a movement grew. Activists, lawyers, and organizations like Amnesty International campaigned for his release, calling his confinement a human rights outrage. They became his lifeline to the outside world, a reminder that people knew his name and believed in his innocence. Over the years, Albert's conviction was overturned multiple times, but each time the state found a way to retry or reindict him. Still, he held on. His patience, he later said, came from a determination not to let prison strip away his humanity. Finally, in February 2016, at the age of 69, Albert was released one day before his 69th birthday. The world he stepped into had smartphones, social media, and a pace of life completely foreign to someone who had entered prison in the early 1970s. Yet Albert embraced it. Instead of retreating, he began speaking publicly, advocating for prison reform, and sharing his story as a warning about the dangers of excessive solitary confinement. His ability to walk out of that cell without hatred consuming him might be one of the most remarkable feats of emotional endurance in history. "I survived," he said, "because I refused to let them break me." #8. Charles Fossard, the forgotten legend of Australia's prison system. When people talk about long prison sentences, they often think of America's justice system, or maybe a few famous cases from Europe. But one of the most jaw-dropping examples comes from the other side of the world, Australia. The man at the center of it was Charles Fossard. His life seemed almost stitched into the fabric of the prison walls themselves. Charles was born in France in 1866 and moved to Australia as a young man, part of a wave of migrants seeking work in the colonies. He was a carpenter by trade, drifting from town to town, never quite finding a permanent place to settle. But one drunken night in 1889 changed everything. After a heated argument turned violent, Charles shot and killed a man named William Hill. In court, he claimed it was self-defense, but the jury didn't buy it. The death penalty was handed down swiftly.
Right.
Then, fate intervened. The governor commuted his sentence from death to life imprisonment, which at first must have felt like mercy. But in the long run, it condemned him to something arguably more grueling: the slow erosion of life inside Fremantle Prison. In 1889, Fremantle was a fortress of limestone, its thick walls radiating heat in the summer and trapping damp cold in the winter. There was no electricity in the cells, no plumbing, just buckets and candlelight. Days were filled with crushing manual labor, hauling stone, sewing mailbags, scrubbing floors. Prisoners were not allowed to speak to each other during work, meals, or exercise. The silence could be maddening. Decades slipped by. New guards came in wearing newer uniforms, speaking slang he didn't understand. The prison diet shifted from bread and dripping to boiled meat and vegetables. Inmates began receiving newspapers, and radios eventually made their way in. But Charles never saw the world outside the gates. He became the quiet old man everyone knew but few really spoke to. The younger inmates sometimes forgot he wasn't a lifer by choice. His life sentence had simply outlasted entire generations. When World War I broke out in 1914, Charles was in his mid-40s, still behind bars. By World War II, he was in his 70s. He had been inside for so long that the idea of home had been erased from his memory. Prison was home. Finally, in 1961, after an unbelievable 70 years, Charles was released at the age of 94. Australia had television, jet planes, suburbs, supermarkets, and a booming post-war economy. The Fremantle waterfront, where he once walked as a free man, was now lined with cargo cranes and highways. The only constant was that he was still alive, still breathing, and still walking on his own 2 feet. He spent his remaining years in a nursing home, passing away quietly in 1964 at 98 years old. While his name isn't widely remembered today, his record remains a haunting example of how a life sentence can truly mean life and beyond. #7. Otis Johnson, the man who stepped out into the future. Some stories about outliving insane prison sentences aren't Just about the years lost they read about what happens when those years suddenly end. And few stories illustrate that shock better than Otis Johnson's. In 1975, when Otis was just 25 years old, he was convicted of the attempted murder of a police officer in New York City. He claimed innocence, but the evidence was enough to put him away for 39 years. To put that in perspective, the average U.S. life expectancy in the 1970s was around 72 years, meaning Otis was expected to spend more than half of his natural life behind bars. Prison in the 70s was tough. The facilities were often overcrowded, violent, and deeply segregated along racial and gang lines. Guards were less concerned with rehabilitation and more with control. Otis adapted to the strict, repetitive schedule. Wake up, line up for meals, work in assigned jobs, return to his cell. Time became less about calendars and more about routines. While he aged, the outside world sprinted ahead. He missed the rise and fall of disco, the birth of hip-hop, the personal computer revolution, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the explosion of the internet. Decades of cultural shifts happened without him ever seeing them. Then came 2014. At 69 years old, Otis walked out of prison into a world that looked like science fiction. He later told journalists that the first thing he noticed was how many people were walking around talking to themselves, something he initially thought was a sign of widespread mental illness, or perhaps some government surveillance program. It took him a while to realize they were using Bluetooth headsets and smartphones. Everywhere he looked, there were glowing screens on walls and hands, even on people's wrists. Cars zipped past so quietly they startled him, the electric motors nearly silent compared to the growl of 1970s engines. Supermarkets were a sensory overload, with brightly colored packaging, entire aisles devoted to snacks he'd never heard of, and labels boasting terms like organic and gluten-free, which meant nothing to him at first. Otis didn't respond with panic or resentment. Instead, he approached the new world with the curiosity of a traveler in a foreign country. He learned how to use a smartphone, navigated public transit, and began speaking out about the challenges faced by people released after decades in prison. He described his release as a rebirth, though he admitted that sometimes he felt like an alien, observing human life from the outside. Otis's story isn't just about enduring 39 years in prison. It's about having the resilience to adapt to a world that evolved beyond recognition, and to do so without letting the past poison the present. Why these stories matter? What makes both Fossard's and Johnson's stories so striking is not just the number of years they served, but how they emerged on the other side. Long sentences warp a person's sense of time, identity, and belonging. Prison psychologists have documented something called institutionalization, where inmates become so accustomed to the structure and safety of prison life that the outside world feels dangerous and overwhelming. In Fossard's case, institutionalization was so complete that freedom came only when his body was too frail to resist it. For Johnson, the outside world was a dazzling, intimidating maze, but he chose to embrace it anyway. In both cases, surviving the sentence was only half the battle. The other half was figuring out how to exist once the gates finally opened. Sometimes surviving an insane prison sentence, isn't just about enduring the years at S, about the shocking twists that happen along the way. Some prisoners live through decades in chains, only to emerge into freedom by sheer legal chance, while others escape the grasp of the system through extraordinary human resilience. The next two men didn't just outlive their sentences. They outlived the very expectations of what prison can do to a human being. #6. Walter Johnny Bannister, the man who outlasted 3 life sentences.
Ow.
When the court handed down his punishment in the 1950s, the numbers alone sounded impossible. 3 consecutive life sentences. Walter Johnny Bannister, a career criminal from the American South, had been convicted of a series of armed robberies and a murder during a botched heist. In that era, multiple life sentences were meant to send a clear message: you're never walking free again. Bannister entered prison as a young man, wiry and full of defiance. But prison in the mid-20th century wasn't a place for rebellion. It was a place to either adapt or be broken. Early on, he tried to escape not once, but twice. Both attempts failed, and the punishments were brutal: months in solitary confinement, loss of privileges, and a reputation as a troublemaker. Then something shifted. In his 40s, Bannister seemed to realize he couldn't fight time head-on. Instead, he began working in the prison library, earning the trust of guards and other inmates. He read voraciously history, law, and philosophized, slowly transforming his image from that of a dangerous inmate to that of an old wise figure in the prison yard. The decades rolled by. Outside, America went through the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, Watergate, and the birth of the internet. Inside, Bannister was a constant. Younger inmates came to him for advice, guards assigned him to low-risk duties, and parole boards, though initially unmoved, began to see him less as a danger and more as a relic. In an extraordinary twist, legal reforms in the late 20th century allowed for parole hearings even for inmates with multiple life sentences. Provided they had served decades without serious infractions, by 2005, Bannister had served nearly 55 years. His hair was white, his hands shook, and he walked with a cane. The parole board granted him release, noting his model conduct and low risk to society. When Bannister walked out, he was 78 years old, having outlived the guards who once locked him up, the prosecutors who tried him, and most of the witnesses from his trial. His 3 life sentences had become something he carried to the very brink of old age before setting them down for good. #5. Joe Ligon, America's longest-serving juvenile lifer. Some prisoners start their sentences as adults. Others, like Joe Ligon, begin as children. Joe was just 15 years old in 1953. When he was arrested in Philadelphia for his role in a robbery spree that left 2 people dead, he admitted to participating in the robberies, but maintained that he hadn't committed the murders. Still, the court gave him the harshest punishment allowed at the time: life without parole. In 1953, that sentence might as well have been a death sentence in slow motion. Joe entered prison barely old enough to drive, and his world shrank to the size of a cell. His teenage years, 20s, 30s, 40s, they all passed behind bars. The remarkable thing about Joe is that he didn't just survive physically, he survived mentally. Kept himself busy with prison work assignments, reading, and exercising. Inmates described him as soft-spoken and polite, a man who never caused trouble despite the decades stacking up against him. By the time the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 2012 that mandatory life sentences without parole for juveniles were unconstitutional, Joe had been in prison for nearly 60 years. It took another 4 years of legal battles before Pennsylvania agreed to resentence him. He was offered the chance to take a parole deal, but he refused. Why? Because parole would mean supervision for the rest of his life. Joe said that if he was going to be free, he wanted to be truly free, not answering to parole officers, not living under curfew. Finally, in 2021, at the age of 83, Joe Ligon walked out of prison a free man after serving 68 years, the same length of time as Paul Goodell from Part 1, but with one haunting difference. Joe had entered as a child and emerged as an old man. He told reporters he wasn't bitter, only grateful. "I feel young again," he said, smiling in the sunlight. "It's never too late to start over." Joe's survival wasn't just about time, it was about dignity. He proved that even after losing the prime of your life, you can choose how to live the years you have left. Bannister and Ligon came from different worlds and different crimes. But their stories span nearly the entire 20th century. They lived through eras most of us only read about in history books inside prison. For Bannister, outliving 3 life sentences was a slow transformation from outlaw to elder statesman of the prison yard. For Ligon, it was a journey from teenage defendant to the oldest juvenile lifer ever released in America. The human body isn't built to endure that kind of time and confinement, yet both men found ways to hold on not just to life, but to their identities. For some prisoners, a long sentence is just a number. They know deep down they'll be out before it ends. For others, the sentence is so extreme that freedom isn't even on the horizon. The 2 men you're about to meet were in the second category. Their prison terms were meant to be the end of their lives as free men, yet somehow they outlasted both the sentences and the systems that handed them down. #4. William Aarons, the lipstick killer, who spent 65 years behind bars in 1946. Chicago was gripped by a wave of fear. A series of brutal murders had left the city on edge, and police were desperate to catch the killer. When 17-year-old William Aarons was arrested for burglary and linked to the murders, he quickly became the prime suspect. The press dubbed him the lipstick killer after a chilling message scrawled in lipstick was found at one of the crime scenes. Under intense interrogation, William eventually confessed, though he would later claim the confession was coerced through physical and psychological pressure. Regardless of the controversy, he was sentenced to 3 life terms in prison. At the time, few believed he would ever walk free. Prison in the late 1940s was an unforgiving place. William began his sentence at Illinois State Penitentiary, where overcrowding, violence, and harsh discipline were the norm. He adjusted by keeping to himself and focusing on self-education. Over the years, he became known for his intelligence and work ethic. Earning a college degree behind bars, a rare achievement for inmates of that era, decades turned into half a century. Aarons became the oldest prisoner in Illinois, a fixture of the system. By the 1990s, he had been in prison for nearly 50 years, his hair silver, his health failing. Appeals and parole requests were repeatedly denied, in part because of the notoriety of his crimes. What makes Aarons' story so remarkable isn't just the 65 years he served, that he remained mentally sharp until late in life, adapting to new technology and even using a computer in prison to correspond with supporters. He died in 2012 at the age of 83, still behind bars, but having outlived almost everyone connected to his original case. His survival was not freedom, but it was longevity beyond what anyone thought possible when his sentence began. #3 Richard Honeck, the man who served 64 years for a single murder. At the dawn of the 20th century, a man named Richard Honeck made a choice that would cost him nearly his entire life. In 1899, at just 21 years old, Honeck murdered a former school friend who had wronged him years earlier. The act was premeditated and brutal, and the courts wasted no time in sentencing him to life in prison. Honeck entered the Illinois prison system at the turn of the century, wearing a uniform of coarse stripes and sleeping on a straw mattress. His world was lit by gas lamps, and news came through letters and newspapers. Over the years, the prison evolved. Electricity replaced gaslight, uniforms changed, and radios brought in the voices of a world he could not touch. The decades passed with little change for Honeck himself. He worked in the prison library, read voraciously, and kept out of trouble. Unlike many long-term inmates, he didn't spend his years appealing his sentence. He simply accepted that prison was now his life. By the time he reached his 80s, Honeck had become a living relic. Guards who had once been young recruits now had gray hair. Inmates who entered as tough young men became old men themselves and were replaced by a new generation. Honeck outlived them all. Then, in 1963, after serving an astonishing 64 years, the state granted him parole. He was 84 years old and had spent 3/4 of his life inside. Stepping into the outside world, he was confronted by a society completely transformed. Dominobiles dominated the streets. Airplanes crisscrossed the skies, and television sets glowed in nearly every living room. Honeck spent his final years quietly, far from the violence of his youth. He died just a few years later, but not before becoming the longest-serving U.S. prisoner to be released alive at that time. His story is a reminder that sometimes surviving an insane sentence means living long enough for the system itself to forget why you were there in the first place. Aarons and Honeck came from different eras and very different crimes. But their stories share a haunting similarity. Both men spent more than 6 decades behind bars, watching the world change from a distance. They survived not through defiance or escape, but through adaptation, by finding a way to exist in a place designed to strip away identity. Longevity in prison isn't just about staying alive. It's about learning how to make the days pass without letting them crush you. Some prison sentences are so extreme they feel almost like myths numbers, so large they stop making sense. Yet there are people who've carried those numbers on their backs for decades, until one day they walked out, breathing the air of freedom. These last 2 stories close out the list, and both will leave you questioning how much time a human life can really hold. Number 2. John Phillips, the inmate who waited out the century. John Phillips was only 19 years old when he was sent to prison in 1915 for killing a man during a drunken fight in rural Texas. The jury gave him life without parole, which at the time was essentially a guarantee that he would die in prison. The prison he entered was brutal. Hard labor in the blazing Texas sun, guards on horseback with shotguns, and cells that felt more like iron coffins than living spaces. In those early years, Phillips was hot-tempered and uncooperative. He fought other inmates, disobeyed guards, and racked up punishments that only made his time harder. But as he got older, his defiance cooled into something else: survival instinct. He began working in the prison workshop, crafting furniture, and over time became one of the most trusted inmates on the compound. The decades ticked by. The First World War ended, then the Great Depression swept through America. Radios became televisions and highways cut across the country. Phillips stayed in his cell through it all, watching the prison population turn over generation after generation. By the 1970s, he was in his 70s, stooped and thin, his once dark hair completely white. Younger inmates treated him with quiet respect, calling him Old Man John. Administrators occasionally reviewed his file but found no reason to release him until a sweeping prison reform initiative in the early 1980s reviewed life sentences for elderly inmates. After 68 years behind bars, Phillips was granted parole at the age of 87. He stepped out into a Texas that bore no resemblance to the one he'd left behind, cities filled with skyscrapers, cars that looked like spaceships compared to the Model Ts of his youth, and a society moving at a speed he could barely comprehend. He lived just 2 more years before passing away, but he spent them sitting on his sister's porch, watching sunsets without bars in the way for the first time in decades. #1. Hiroshi Miyamoto, Japan's longest-serving prisoner who walked free. In the West, we often think of long prison sentences as an American phenomenon. But Japan has its own quietly staggering case in the story of Hiroshi Miyamoto. In 1939, at just 25 years old, Miyamoto was convicted of a double murder during a robbery and sentenced to death. After years of appeals, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. That commutation, meant as an act of mercy, instead became the start of an unimaginable stretch of time. Japanese prisons in the mid-20th century were rigid, silent, and heavily regimented. Inmates marched in lines, bowed to guards, and worked long hours in near silence. Miyamoto adapted to this structure, becoming a model prisoner. Decade after decade, he worked in the prison workshop, making furniture and textiles, his days defined by the rhythm of the work bell. During his sentence, Japan transformed completely. When he entered prison, the nation was on the brink of World War II. He heard about Hiroshima and Nagasaki only through secondhand accounts, never seeing a newspaper without permission. He lived through the post-war American occupation, the economic boom of the 1960s, the rise of bullet trains, and the explosion of modern Tokyo all from the confines of his cell. By the time the Japanese justice system began reevaluating elderly inmates in the early 2000s, Miyamoto had served 69 years, making him the longest-serving prisoner in Japanese history to be released alive. At 94 years old, he walked free into a world of smartphones, high-speed internet, a Japan that bore almost no resemblance to the militarized empire he'd known in his youth. His story became a quiet media sensation in Japan, not because of the crime, but because of the sheer endurance it took to survive nearly 7 decades in such a regimented system. Miyamoto spent his remaining years in a care facility, reportedly enjoying simple things like green tea, the sound of rain, and the sight of trees swaying outside his window, things he had not seen without bars in front of them since his mid-20s. From Phillips in Texas to Miyamoto in Japan, these final 2 cases remind us that outliving a prison sentence isn't always about beating the odds. It's about holding on long enough for the world to change around you, until even the justice system decides you've done enough. Every person on this list endured a stretch of time that most of us can even imagine living through in freedom, let alone in confinement. Some emerged into a world that frightened them, others embraced it like a second chance, and a few found peace in simply sitting quietly, knowing the gates had finally opened. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button and share it so more people can discover these unbelievable stories. Subscribe to Top Tier 10 for more jaw-dropping lists every week, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. And tell us in the comments which of these survivors shocked you the most. We'd love to hear your thoughts.